He had no name, no voice. And yet, he gave me back my humanity. There are things you just never forget, even when you try. It's not about memory. It's skin. It's scent. It's that feeling of having lived through something the whole world pretended never happened. I've seen a lot of pain stitched up in silence. I've touched wounds that no longer bled, but still screamed. And still, among all the stories lost in the war wards, there was one that never left me. Not when time took away my strength. Not when old age took my colleagues. Not even when I tried to convince myself I was just doing the right thing. Because in that moment, I knew I wasn't. War is loud. But there are moments in it that feel almost silent. Like the world is holding its breath. Like time is hesitating. And it was in one of those silences that I found him. Hidden where no one would look. Wounded in ways no one could see. Alive. Even when everyone had already decided he wasn't. You might think a nurse should never hide a patient. That there are rules, procedures, a chain of command. But if you had seen his eyes, if you had felt that kind of desperation that doesn't scream, just pleads, you would have lied too. You would have risked everything. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to care in secret. This isn't just a war story. It's a story about instinct, about compassion, and about a secret that's followed me like a shadow ever since that day. And if I've decided to speak now, it's not because I'm looking for redemption. It's because maybe, just maybe, someone on the other side of this screen also had to hide something out of love. My name is Shirley Mae Johnson. I'm 89 years old, and I carry more silences than years on my shoulders. I live alone, in a small apartment in Boston, surrounded by bookshelves that nearly touch the ceiling. My books are my company. Old medical manuals from the 1940s, maps with names time has erased, and an antique globe that spins like the world might still go back to where it broke. I always wear my deep wine-colored velvet dress, even if no one notices anymore. The thick wool on my legs isn't for vanity. It's a ritual. It reminds me I'm still here, that I still remember, that I still know. I was head nurse at the Dachau concentration camp, right after the liberation. I arrived when the air still reeked of gunpowder and burnt flesh, when the eyes of the survivors looked like caves. And among all the horrors I saw, all the bodies I tried to save or bury with dignity, there was one I hid, one no one was supposed to find. Not because I wanted to be a hero, but because in that instant, something inside me screamed louder than any order. Today, only the ticking of the wall clock or the creak of the floorboards remind me I'm still in the present. But this story never aged. It looks at me every time I close my eyes. And now, I want to tell it. Because maybe, if you listen to the end, you'll see that some wounds don't need to be exposed to be healed. Sit with me for a while. This story's been quiet for far too long. And if this memory stirs something in you, subscribe to the channel. We carry more stories than we realize. And sometimes, all it takes is someone willing to listen. We arrived in Dachau on a gray afternoon, the whole sky caught in a breath that didn't know whether it was relief or mourning. The camp had been liberated by American soldiers just days before, but it still reeked of fear and death. It wasn't a concentration camp anymore. It was a cemetery suspended in time, a place where horror lingered even when pain no longer had a voice. And me. I was just a woman with a clipboard, a clean apron, and a knot in my stomach that hadn't loosened since Munich. There were too many bodies to count, and the living moved like ghosts, who hadn't yet realized the gate had been opened. They wandered aimlessly, their eyes hollow like holes torn into the fabric of the world. Many wouldn't even look at our faces. Others stared like we were some late-stage hallucination, one last mirage before real death set in. And there, on that land saturated with grief, I was officially assigned as head nurse at a makeshift clinic set up inside one of the old administrative barracks. The room they gave me was small, with a window boarded up haphazardly, and a metal cot that creaked every time someone shifted. I had 4 assistants, all of them far too young, and an Austrian doctor who spoke English with a mix of bitterness and shame. On the first night, while I organized syringes and folded gauze sheets, I heard a strange sound coming from the end of the hallway. A muffled sob, like the final breath of a wound that never truly closed. But no one else heard it. Or maybe they pretended not to. What stuck with me most that first week wasn't the screams. It was the silence. A heavy, damp silence, like even the earth was tired of swallowing so many secrets. War teaches you that too much pain becomes mute. That some cries don't come out through tears, but through the smell of sweat, through the way your skin shivers without wind, through the way someone holds your hand just a little too tightly, like they're trying to keep their own name from slipping away. And it was in that setting, among morphine, incomplete records, and rows of men and women hollowed out by hunger, that I started to feel a strange unease in a far corner of the camp. There was a section marked off limits, behind the old Nazi infirmary, where no one was allowed to go. Officially, they said it was in ruins, that the roof had collapsed, but the guard wouldn't even speak of it. And one of the survivors, an old man who could barely walk, once pointed that way and whispered a word I've never forgotten. Hidden. Something lit up in me then. It wasn't curiosity. It was instinct, like something was whispering, "Go there." Like, among all the faces, one was still missing. Like a fragment of the story was still trembling behind cracked walls, waiting to be found. And I was a nurse. I was trained to recognize when something throbbed, even if the skin looked untouched. The next night I went out alone with a flashlight hidden beneath my coat. The air was thick, smelled like moldy hay and old urine. Every step echoed off the bricks like a warning. But I went anyway, because sometimes the only way to do what's right is to break what feels safe. The entrance to the off-limits wing was a rusted iron door, half open, covered by a broken board with German writing too faded to read. One push was enough and it gave way with a long groan, like it was apologizing for still existing. I stepped inside. The darkness in there wasn't just an absence of light. It was thick, almost solid, like it carried centuries of screams that never got the chance to echo. My flashlight shook, not from the weight, but from my own hand. The hallways were narrow, damp, low ceilings, the smell of mold soaked deep into stone. I stepped on shards of glass, splinters, and fragments of torn-apart lives. There were marks on the walls, scratches like fingernails, tallies drawn in dried blood or coal. At one point I heard something. A faint sound, barely there. Not an animal. Human. A breath. I followed it. My feet ached, not from walking, but from the memories the place stirred. Then I stopped in front of a wall that didn't make sense. There was a crack. Small, almost invisible. But air was pushing through it, like another world was hiding behind those bricks. I carefully moved the debris aside. Behind it, a narrow opening like a vertical trapdoor. I crouched down, and there, for the first time, I saw him. I can't explain what kept me from screaming or running. There was something in the way he looked at me, even with his eyes closed. A kind of presence that didn't beg. It endured. He was lying on rags, his body thin. covered in dry wounds and old bruises. His lips were cracked, his face hidden under a patchy beard. The bones in his face stuck out, and his gaze, though faint, felt too deep for someone still alive. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But he was breathing, slow, steady, like he somehow knew someone had finally found him. I got closer. There was no natural light, only the trembling beam of my flashlight. I touched his forehead. Warm, feverish. He was still fighting. Next to him there was nothing but an old bucket, a torn blanket, and what looked like a strip of cloth, with something written in faded Yiddish. The smell was unbearable, but what truly suffocated me was something else. The question with no answer. Who was he? And why was he here? I went back to the infirmary without saying a word. I grabbed a first aid kit, antibiotics, gauze. I hid everything in a bucket under some cloth and returned through the side of the camp, long past midnight. I didn't want anyone to see me, because I already knew what I was going to do. I was going to care for him. I was going to hide him, even though I didn't know if he was a prisoner, a deserter, a spy, or just a man the world had left behind. As I gave him the first penicillin shot, his body trembled. His eyes opened for just a second, and in that second, I saw something. Not fear, not pain, but a raw, silent kind of gratitude. The kind no one teaches you. A connection that cut through me like a quiet truth. On the way out, I leaned the board back against the entrance, like sealing up a secret. But deep down, I already knew. This man wasn't just another body to be treated. He was a story, and I had just become part of it. The next morning, I couldn't stop the shaking in my hands. As I handed out quinine doses in the main barrack, my head was somewhere else, back in the forbidden wing, behind that wall, where that man was still breathing like every inhale was a thread being pulled from the edge of life. No one said a word. None of the superiors noticed I'd been gone for hours the night before, and that only made the truth louder. No one wanted to know what else might be hidden in there. Liberation had been a celebration with a limited guest list. And him, he wasn't on it. I went back to him that same night, carrying a bit of watery soup hidden in a thermos, 2 clean cloths, and a clay jug filled with fresh water. I didn't even know his name. I still hadn't heard his voice. But there was something about him. Maybe the way his fingers twitched gently when I pressed cotton to his skin, or the way he furrowed his brow in deep sleep, like someone fighting memories that don't have edges. The fever hadn't broken. His eyes opened now and then, but they didn't seem to see, like they were looking inward. I cleaned his wounds carefully, trying not to wake the pain too much. In that dark corner of the barracks, time moved differently. Hours didn't pass. They just sighed. And me. I started hearing my own heartbeat the way it did when I was young, when I believed I could heal the world with compresses and courage. In the mornings, I went back to my routine like I was just another nurse in a line of many. But inside, something was coming undone. Because for the first time since I'd arrived in that camp, I felt like I was touching something that wasn't just duty. It was choice. It was soul. It was secret. I started calling him, softly, the Invisible One. Not because he lacked presence, but because, among so many exposed men and women, he was the one screaming loudest, without making a sound. And that hurt me. Because a body no one looks for turns into a nameless memory. And a nameless memory becomes just another number. But he wasn't a number. He was human. He was a man. And someone, somewhere, had loved him. Or maybe not even that. Maybe that's exactly why he hurt so much. One of the boys working with me, Ellis, mentioned he'd heard noises coming from the closed wing. Probably a rat or a wild cat, I said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. And that's when I realized this wasn't just an act of compassion. It was betrayal, to the war's eyes, to the reports, to the chain of command. I was hiding a wounded man who couldn't be registered. Worse, I was growing attached to him. Even without knowing who he was, I began to long for that moment each day, like someone waiting for the last bit of light before complete darkness. Sitting next to him, even in silence, made the rest of the camp feel just a little more bearable. Like by caring for a stranger, I was also stitching back something inside myself that war had ripped apart without mercy. But what I didn't know yet was that there was much more behind that silence than I was ready to uncover. On the 5th night, I brought a piece of hardened bread and a warm towel tucked inside my coat. The temperature had dropped, and the wind slipped through invisible cracks, carrying a chill that wasn't just from the cold. As I stepped into the wing, I smelled his body before I saw his face. He was still alive. But something had shifted. I can't explain how. The air felt different, thicker, suspended, like he had dreamed something that pulled him back from the edge of unconsciousness. I approached slowly. He was sitting up, leaning against the brick wall, his eyes open, drifting through the dark. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, and something in that look made me take half a step back. It wasn't fear. It was knowing. As if in that moment he knew more about me than I ever would about him. I knelt beside him the way I did every night, and placed a hand on his shoulder. For the first time he whispered something, too soft to catch the words, but the tone stayed with me, a blend of sorrow and reverence. Then, slowly, he reached out his hand and offered me a crumpled piece of cloth. It took me a moment to understand what it was. But when I opened it, I saw a scrap of uniform and a symbol. It wasn't American or Russian. It was German, an SS medic insignia. I felt the floor drop beneath my knees. For a moment far too long, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. The emblem, faded but unmistakable. A Gothic eagle perched above the rod of Asclepius, used by physicians within the Nazi ranks. My whole body went rigid. My eyes searched for more clues. I looked at him. He said nothing. Just lowered his gaze, as if confirming, yes, it's mine. I shot to my feet, took 2 steps back. I wanted to scream, to run, to bolt the door shut. But what stopped me was the way he laid back down. No urgency, no defense. Like he had already expected I'd leave him to whatever fate awaited. And that posture, that quiet surrender, broke something in me. I sat back down. The questions tore through me in silence. Was he a camp doctor? Had he been there when the horrors unfolded? Did he take part? Or had he disobeyed orders? Maybe even tried to save someone? None of it made sense, but all of it weighed heavy. I tucked the scrap of fabric into my bra, close against my chest, like I was trying to keep it hidden from both eyes and judgment. From that night on, my mind became a battlefield, between instinct and condemnation, between compassion and doubt. And the cruelest part was, even with that symbol, even with everything he might have done or witnessed, I still couldn't stop caring for him, because there was something stronger than truth in that dark room, a bond that words couldn't explain, and that scared me more than any insignia ever could. Things started to shift in the main infirmary. No one said anything out loud, but I felt it in their eyes. A delay in Ellis's usual greeting, a thicker silence when I entered the triage room. Someone had noticed my nightly absences, and in places like that, where everything has already been lost, even the smallest gestures take on dangerous meaning. War teaches you to distrust even silence. On Friday, As I was administering fluids to a frail Hungarian woman who could barely keep her eyes open, I overheard 2 soldiers talking just outside, near the forbidden wing. One said, "You heard it again last night?" I thought it was an animal, but it sounded human. The other scoffed. "These places still have bones trying to scream." I couldn't finish the stitch. My hand faltered, and the old woman, weak as she was, looked at me like she understood. That man, the wounded one behind the wall, the invisible one, had become part of my pulse. I spent the whole day afraid someone would find him, and the whole night afraid of finding out who he truly was. I cared for him in silence, but my soul screamed louder every time his wounds began to heal, and he looked back at me. It was no longer a vacant stare, no longer just pain. It was presence, and that unsettled me more than any accusation could. One day, while changing the bandages on his arm, I noticed a small scar on his left wrist. It was precise, clean, surgical. A sign of despair or punishment? I don't know. But what struck me was how he always tried to hide that wrist from me. Always turned it away, as if protecting a secret tattooed beneath the skin. That night I returned to my quarters with my stomach in knots. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror, the one always fogged from the steam of boiling medicine. I didn't recognize the reflection. The hollow eyes, the bloodless lips, the face marked not just by time, but by something deeper, doubt. And there, alone, under dim light, and with the creaking of the camp's bones echoing in the distance, I finally understood. I was closer to him than to any other soul in that place. Not because I knew him, but because, somehow, in a way I couldn't explain, my soul recognized his. As if we had lived through the same silence, just in different languages. But that same night, I found a paper under the cot where he slept, folded 4 times, nearly invisible. My hands trembled as I opened it. It was a handwritten note in German, with phrases scratched out, incomplete thoughts. I could make out only a few words. "I couldn't," she screamed. "There was too much blood. I hid the evidence." I don't know if he wrote it. I don't know if it belonged to someone who had been there before. But the paper was clean, without dust, recent. I tucked the note alongside the uniform scrap inside my bra. And that night, when I closed the iron door behind me and heard the muffled groan of the hinge, I knew with a certainty I couldn't shake. Whatever he was going to tell me before the end, I might not be ready to hear it. I started watching more than caring. Every move he made seemed to carry a fragment, a loose piece of a puzzle that, no matter how I tried, never quite came together. He still didn't speak, and in a way that silence brought me both closer and farther at the same time. The absence of words made him a mirror. I projected what I feared, what I needed, what I didn't understand, and he accepted that reflection without resistance. When the fever eased, he would sit up, always the same way, leaning into the corner of the wall, knees drawn to his chest, arms crossed over them, his eyes fixed on a place only he could see. One time I reached out and touched his palm. He didn't pull away, but he didn't respond either. It was like touching a cold memory. On an especially overcast day, I brought him a shard of mirror I had found among the rubble, small, cracked at the edges. I wanted him to see his own face, maybe awaken something, maybe spark a flicker of identity. But the moment he saw the reflection, he turned away like he'd witnessed a crime. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressed his forehead to his arm, and breathed hard. It hit me like an invisible slap. He knew who he was. He just couldn't bear to remember. Some days he would doze off in short spells, And in those moments he murmured fragmented words. One name surfaced twice. Miriam. The second time he whispered it, a single tear slid down his face. I wiped it away with my coat sleeve, without asking. Because some questions don't seek answers. They seek relief. And I didn't want relief. I wanted to listen. I tried to cross-reference the name with the records. Lists of prisoners, German medical staff, local nurses, translators. Nothing. As if Miriam existed only as a shadow inside him, or a guilt too alive to ever be erased. There was something else that haunted me. His eyes. Light brown, almost amber. They didn't match the typical features of SS officers. There was something Mediterranean in them. Something that reminded me of the Jewish men from North Africa who had arrived at the camp just days earlier, from makeshift convoys. What did that mean? Was he an infiltrator? A prisoner doctor? A traitor to both sides? I began searching his rags more carefully. Once I found a small coin sewn into the hem of his pants. A Polish coin from 1938, corroded, barely legible. And beside it, a child's coat button, light blue, shaped like a rabbit. That broke me. Who hides children's buttons sewn into their clothes in an extermination camp? That night I sat beside him longer than usual. I held his hand. He didn't resist. We stayed there silent. Two strangers who might have had more in common than the world would ever allow us to admit. And in that moment, for the first time since I found him, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. What if he wasn't hiding from the Allies, or the Germans, but from himself? It was on a morning that tasted of iron and fog when Captain Morrow arrived. Tall, precise, with eyes as light as they were cold. An officer sent by American command to oversee post-liberation procedures. He came armed with reports, questions, and a clipboard that felt heavier than any medicine we had in our cabinets. As he walked the corridors, everything fell silent. His boots seemed to etch warnings into the concrete floor with each step. Whatever is hidden will be found. That same afternoon he pulled me aside. "Nurse Johnson," he said, not even bothering to look up. "The East Wing has been cleared for inspection. I want your support with the structural triage." My blood froze. The East Wing. The very wing where the invisible one slept, where my secret still breathed. I forced a smile, answered with carefully measured steadiness. "Of course, sir. I just need to finish up 2 patient rounds before I join you." He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me too long, as if he already knew, as if he was on the edge of opening the wrong door, out of sheer instinct. I rushed to my room. Cold sweat trickled down the back of my neck like winter had nested inside me. I couldn't move him alone. He was still too weak, and for the first time I thought, maybe I'd made a mistake bringing him here. Not for my sake, but for his. I returned to the hiding place just as the sun began dipping behind the stone walls. He was awake. He saw me come in. And for the first time, he smiled. A small, hesitant smile, almost childlike. That expression unraveled me, because to smile in a place like that, it was an act of resistance I'd forgotten how to do. I knelt, touched his arm, and spoke in the softest voice I've ever used. "They're going to come looking for you. And I don't know what's going to happen if they find you." He didn't speak, but he gripped my hand, tight, with a silent urgency that told me more than words ever could, as if to say, "If I have to be found, let it be by you." I ran back to the infirmary, managed to delay the inspection for 1 more day, claiming a gas leak in the sterilization system. A technical lie no one was eager to challenge, but it cost me. Ellis gave me a strange look. The Austrian doctor asked if I was sleeping well. I answered with a yes that not even my bones believed. That night, before bed, I sat at the edge of my cot and held the scrap of uniform, the coin, the child's button. I cupped them all in my hands like they were fragments of the same man, or pieces of several versions of him that would never meet. And I thought to myself, if you've listened this far, it's because you know this kind of silence too. The kind we hide in our chest, but that pulses like truth. So keep listening, because there's something here that maybe belongs to you too. I've always kept notebooks, since the start of the war. Small hardcover ones where I'd jot down doses, symptoms, names of soldiers who died too quickly for me to remember by heart. But that night, I wrote differently. It wasn't a report. It wasn't a diary. It was a kind of confession I never meant to hand to anyone, only to time. Because part of me felt that if something happened, someone would need to know. And if no one ever asked, at least it would be written. I wrote about him. Not his name. I still didn't know it. I didn't even know if he had one. I called him the man of the fevered silence. I recorded the medical care I'd given, the symptoms, the lack of responses. But I also wrote the things that don't fit on a chart. The way he looked at me when I moistened his lips, the subtle twitch of his shoulders every time someone said the word, camp. Even from a distance, as if the word itself was a blade. And I described the blue bunny-shaped button with a kind of reverence I didn't know I still had in me. What I did in that notebook was try to make sense, in writing, of something my heart hadn't yet dared to accept, that I was protecting someone who might not be innocent, but also that maybe innocence was a luxury that hadn't survived inside those fences. Writing tore me more than tending to him. Each letter felt like a blade sliding across old skin. Not because remembering hurt, but because writing it down did. Because once written, it becomes real. It becomes fact. And facts can't be undone. They sleep, or they convict. I hid the notebook behind the row of anatomy books, on the highest shelf of the barracks bookcase. The place no one ever touched, where only those who know the ache of old bones dare to reach. I went back to him shortly after. It was past midnight and the air smelled like wet coal. He was awake, sitting as always, his head lowered. I came close, and in an unplanned moment I pressed my forehead to his. Just for a second. But in that second I felt something the war had never given me. Shelter. Not the kind that protects the body, but the kind that sees the soul. Still silent, he reached into the inside pocket of the ragged coat he wore and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He handed it to me. I unwrapped it. It was a carved piece of wood, a primitive, crooked heart with 3 letters etched in rough strokes. MJL. I wanted to ask. I wanted to know. But all I managed to say was, "Is this all you have?" He nodded. And that's when I realized this man was giving me his remnants, not his full story, just the shards, as if to say, rebuild it if you want, but don't expect to understand. In that moment, I wished for something I had never felt for anyone in that camp, that he would survive, not to tell his side, but simply to exist, because there was humanity in him, even buried in ruin. And maybe that's what hurt the most. It was raining that day, a soft, steady rain that seemed to fall from the clouds with the same exhaustion that weighed down our bodies. I was changing the sheets of a patient with gangrene when I heard hurried footsteps in the hallway. Not ordinary footsteps. These had urgency, direction, authority. They were Morrow's. Before I could even wipe my hands, he walked into the room. "Nurse Johnson, come with me. Now." He didn't ask if I was busy, didn't explain where we were going. Just turned and walked off. I followed. The hallway felt narrower than usual, and every step I took echoed louder than I wanted it to. My fingers tingled. My stomach clenched like I'd swallowed a clock full of nails. We turned left, then right. We walked through areas we hadn't used in weeks. And then he stopped in front of the iron door. That same one. The one that groaned like it screamed. My chest locked up. We received reports of suspicious activity in this wing. I need you present for the inspection. Suspicious activity. The words beat inside my head like war drums before an execution. Sir, that wing is compromised, structurally unstable. I offered, my voice hollow. He stared at me for long seconds. No anger, no rush. Just the kind of look that comes from someone who already knows how the story ends, but wants to see how you flinch before the blow. That's exactly why I'm here, he replied, and forced the handle with both hands. The door gave way. Slowly, loudly. A breath of rotting wood, dried blood, and ancient dust slipped through the cracks. He stepped in, and I followed, my legs heavy like the ground had turned to mud beneath me. We walked through the first rooms, empty, filthy. The same ones I knew like the face of my guilt. Morrow scanned everything with the coldness of someone counting the steps before a hanging. And then he stopped in front of the wall I used to enter, the wall that hid the man. He crouched, ran his hand along the base, felt the crack. My heart was pounding too loudly, loud enough for the whole world to hear. Strange, he said. Someone's been here. I stayed silent. No words came. No lies formed. I'll need engineering support, he said finally, scribbling on his clipboard. We're sealing this wing. For safety. And then he left. Only after he disappeared down the hallway did I realize my hand was bleeding. I had driven my nails into my own palm. That night, I walked to the hiding place like someone stepping into their own grave. The wall was still there, untouched. But something was different. He wasn't lying down. He was standing, waiting for me. In the dark, his silhouette looked bigger than the space could hold. And then, for the first time since it all began, he spoke. Just one sentence, a single phrase that shattered me. And that, to this day, I still can't repeat without feeling the ground vanish beneath my feet. His words hit me with the weight of a memory you never asked for, the kind that crashes through your bones and settles in the pit of your stomach before you even understand why. It wasn't about what he said. It was the way he said it. His voice was rough, uninhabited, like it had wandered through deserts inside his chest before finally finding its way out. It didn't tremble. It didn't beg. It simply existed, like someone who no longer had anything to lose or any place left to hide. I stood there, frozen, staring at the man who, until then, had only breathed, smiled faintly, and murmured names in his sleep. Now he spoke. Now he was more than what I had imagined. And what scared me more than anything was the way he looked at me, like he knew exactly what that sentence had done to me. But I didn't ask what it meant. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I just sat beside him again, in silence, like someone who understands that some words are too heavy to unpack, and the best you can do is hold them alongside the one who carries them, even without understanding. Outside, the rain fell in a steady rhythm, like a tired clock ticking. And in that windowless room, the only sounds were water and our breathing. I looked at him, and for the first time I questioned what kept bringing me back night after night. Was it duty, or attachment, or worse, reflection? In war, we're taught to classify bodies: ally, enemy, innocent, guilty. But no one teaches us how to name the ones who live in between, the ones who don't fit in any column of the report, The ones who make us feel too much when all that's asked of us is cold detachment. He was one of those. An in-between. An almost. A maybe. I started noticing his gestures more closely. When he ran his hand over his face, it wasn't just pain. It was habit. When he closed his eyes for more than 20 seconds, it was to avoid memory. And when he smiled, it was always right after I said something in English, as if my language was the only safe place left. I thought about Miriam, the blue button, the carved wooden heart with the letters MJL. And then it hit me like a cold needle to the spine. Maybe he had been a father, or a brother, or a doctor to a child he couldn't save. Maybe his guilt wasn't from what he did, but from what he couldn't do. And maybe deep down that's what kept me so close to him, because I carried those faces too. The eyes that dimmed in my hands, the names I never learned before they slipped away. That night, I wrote another page in the notebook. I didn't record what he said, but I wrote about what I felt hearing him speak, and I ended with a sentence I didn't even know I had inside me. Some secrets don't need to be solved. They just need someone to hold them. Maybe that's what he wanted from me. Not salvation, not judgment, just company in the dark. And in that moment, for the first time in weeks, I wished the world would forget us, that the door to the wing would be sealed shut from the outside, that no one would ever come in again. Because inside those walls, what was happening wasn't war. It was something else, something older, something human. Soul-deep exhaustion can trick the body. I thought I could stay awake another night, but I drifted off, sitting up, my head resting against the cold wall of the barracks. And in that guilt-stained sleep, she came to me, my mother. Not as I saw her in the casket, face shrunken, hands folded in a gesture she'd never have made in life. No, she came to me the way she was when I was 8, standing in the doorway of the porch, hands on her hips, hair tied up in a patterned scarf, and that look that seemed to see right through flesh and bone. In the dream, she didn't say a word. She just looked at me. But it was the kind of look that asks and accuses at the same time. I knew what she was asking, and I also knew I didn't have the answer. My mother was a woman of faith, but not the kind shouted from pulpits. Hers was a faith you cooked into beans, that got scrubbed into porch wood, that was stitched into the cuffs of your children's sleeves. And was one thing she always said was, "Be careful what you see in another's eyes, Shirley Mae, because once you see it, you can't unsee it." I woke up with my breath caught in my chest, like I'd been underwater too long. Dawn hadn't even broken yet, and I was trembling. Not from the cold, from memory. That phrase, one I'd ignored 100 times, now sounded like a prophecy. I went back to him earlier that day, entered quietly, like I was asking permission. He was awake, sitting up, his eyes fixed on some invisible spot. I sat beside him and instinctively touched his hand. It was warmer than usual. The fever was creeping back. But what worried me more was his gaze. It wasn't empty. It was restless, like he too had been visited by ghosts. We sat in silence. The only sounds were our breathing and a distant rat chewing through old wood. I wanted to ask about Miriam, about the blue button, about the wooden heart with the initials. But I couldn't, because what I feared most wasn't the answer. It was what that answer might do to how I felt about him. The button was still with me, sewn into the inside pocket of my coat, like I'd become the hiding place now. Sometimes I pressed it between my fingers just to remind myself it was real, that he was real, that this wasn't some invention of my exhausted mind. And in that moment, watching him, I remembered something else my mother used to say when I felt lost. If someone's soul doesn't deceive you, maybe you're meant to guard the part of them that still wants to live. And maybe that was it. Maybe he was surviving because of my watchfulness, because I refused to stop seeing something in him when the rest of the world only saw danger. But the question that kept growing inside me, stealing my sleep, was a different one. And if, by seeing something good in him, I was blinding myself to something terrible. On the third Sunday after Morrow's arrival, the order was clear. All blocks were to be inspected again, this time with engineers and representatives from the UN. The abandoned wings would be officially decommissioned and sealed. Any unauthorized human presence would be considered a serious violation, with consequences ranging from suspension to immediate removal from duty. I stood staring at the paper pinned to the infirmary door, the directive printed in 2 languages. My hands trembled slightly, but my feet remained steady. By then, fear no longer carried the same weight. It had become an old companion you learned to keep in your pocket. The real problem was something else entirely. What to do with him? The man of silence, the man with the blue button, the man who spoke a sentence that still throbbed inside me, formless and unfinished. I had to get him out of there. But where? He still couldn't walk steadily. And even if he could, where would he go? It would be like abandoning a living memory in the middle of nowhere. That night, I sat at my desk with a blank medical form. I stared at the paper for a long while, as if the paper itself might pass judgment. Then I took a deep breath, dipped the pen, and wrote a name. A name that sounded simple, forgettable, harmless: Jonathan M. Lowell. I invented a date of birth, made up an entry via a Hungarian prisoner convoy, and filled in a generic diagnosis: catatonic state with a history of severe physical and psychological trauma. No consistent verbal response. I signed my name at the bottom as the attending nurse, then folded the paper 3 times and slipped it into the provisional record folder, the one nobody ever really checked, the one where stateless patients quietly disappeared into the anonymity of spreadsheets. It was the first time I had ever lied in writing, but I didn't feel guilt. What I felt was relief, as if by naming him, even falsely, I had pulled him from limbo, as if inventing an identity gave him the right to exist again. Because a body without a name is like a scream without an echo, and he had already been silence for far too long. In the hiding place, I showed him the form. He didn't understand at first, but when I pointed to the name, then to myself, then to him, he nodded. He didn't smile, but his eyes shimmered, just for a second. And that was everything. I returned to my quarters with a duplicate of the form tucked into my coat pocket. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the blue button between my fingers. I almost sewed it into the hem of my coat, as if, in that simple act, I was saying, if the world forgets you, I won't. Deep down, I knew I'd crossed a line. That now, I wasn't just a nurse. I was an accomplice to a secret. And more than that, I had become the keeper of a war fragment no one else dared to hold. I started to get sick. Not with a fever or cough or rashes on my skin. It was something else. A kind of exhaustion that settled between my bones and my thoughts. Like my body was carrying the weight of another body. Invisible, but real. I began to forget things, misplace objects, swap names, smell blood even when I was surrounded only by soap and gauze. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with the overwhelming sense that someone was watching me. And sometimes, they were. A Polish nurse, hollow-eyed and always a little too quiet, followed me with her gaze down the hallways. One time we crossed paths in the dining room, and she simply said, "There are too many ghosts where you walk." I didn't reply. She wasn't expecting an answer. She was just another woman who'd seen too many people disappear, in silence. It was in that air of muffled tension that the journalists arrived. 3, to be exact. 2 Americans and a Frenchman, all with cameras and predator's eyes. They didn't come for us. They came for the horror. For the barracks, the hanging clothes, the piles of bodies still waiting to be buried. But it only took one camera to turn in the wrong direction for my stomach to twist itself into a fist again. They began walking through areas no one had bothered with in weeks. When I asked Captain Morrow about their route, he replied with a dry chuckle. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. Maybe it was a bluff. Maybe it was a warning. Either way, it landed on me like lead. That night, I returned to the hiding place with a lump in my throat. He was asleep, or pretending. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, and for the first time I cried in front of him. Not loudly. No sobs. Just the quiet kind of crying. The kind I remembered from my childhood, when the women in my life wept into dishcloths at the sink, their faces hidden behind wet cotton. He didn't open his eyes, but he reached out his hand. Just that. And in that gesture I understood something unshakable. We were bound now in a way that couldn't be undone. I was responsible for him, for the good and the terrible, for what he had done, and for what he maybe hadn't been able to stop. The next day, one of the journalists pushed hard to access the East Wing. He wanted raw images, he said. Morrow gave in, and when I heard the padlock had been removed, I nearly dropped the tray I was carrying. I ran. I got there just after them. I masked my panic, said there was a structural collapse risk, that the infirmary was unstable. One of the soldiers laughed. Same old excuse. For the first time, Morrow looked at me without blinking, as if saying, I know. I figured it out. I'm just waiting to see how far you'll go. That night, I found him more alert than ever. I sat, touched his forehead, and whispered, The world's listening now, and it doesn't forgive silence. He opened his eyes, looked at me, and whispered 4 words that changed everything. But what he said, I never told anyone. Not under oath. Not on my deathbed. Because there are truths that don't die with the dead. They bury the ones who survive. The order came on a stifling morning, when the smell of sulfur from the crematorium still clung to the air like a memory that hadn't been washed away properly. We received the notice that the American medical team would be relocated. Emergency recall of technical health personnel, the paper read. We had 2 days to pack everything. A plane would be waiting for us in Munich. I sat on the edge of a cot where an Austrian patient was sleeping and stared down at my own hands. They were red from washing cloths, cutting gauze, giving injections. But it felt like they had aged faster than the rest of me. It was in them I saw the weight of all the things I wouldn't be able to carry with me. That afternoon I went to the hiding place. He could stand on his own now, with a little help. He was thinner but steady. His eyes were different too. Not faded, not fevered, but resigned. Like he already knew that the end wouldn't come with bullets or trials, but with the departure of the person who had kept him hidden. I sat beside him and said it out loud for the first time. I'm leaving. He didn't answer, just lowered his eyes. I paused, then continued. You can come with me. I don't know how far. I don't know if I can get you through. But I'll try. I didn't even know what I was saying. Part of me understood it was nearly impossible. He had no documents. The name I'd given him was just ink on paper. And he still wore the Nazi medical insignia sewn inside the lining of his tattered coat. But even so, I wanted to try. Because sometimes you don't try out of hope. You try out of honor. Early the next morning I packed food, gauze, a vial of penicillin, and the blue button sewn into the pocket of my coat. I tied up his few belongings in a cloth bundle and took him along the side of the camp, where guards had been reduced to a bare minimum. We crossed the tracks together, for the first time since I found him. The moon was high, but a layer of mist blurred the path. At the exit gate, we were stopped. "Identification," the guard said, groggy from the cold. I handed over my papers. He looked at me, then at him. And his. I hesitated, felt heat rising to my face. My hands started to sweat. "He's support staff, being reassigned with me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The soldier frowned, flipped through a list. My heart pounded like an old war drum, off rhythm, out of time. And then, before the guard could say anything else, the man stepped forward, placed a hand on my shoulder, and whispered something in my ear, softly, clearly, in a language I didn't speak, but I understood. He looked at me one last time, smiled, then turned around and walked back toward the camp, not running, not hesitating. He just went back. The soldier handed my documents back, muttered something about unpredictable lunatics, and waved me through. I walked forward, but something in me stayed with him. The years passed like a night train, long, loud on the inside, but invisible to anyone watching from the outside. I came back to the United States with my soul folded up inside me, like a poorly washed sheet. I worked in rural hospitals for a while, then in nursing schools. I never returned to a camp, never walked into a containment wing again, and never, not once, did I speak of him to anyone. The records for Jonathan M. Lowell vanished during the reorganization of medical files. The name I invented disappeared like pencil marks under the rain. But his face, that never left. That fevered gaze, the blue button, the carved wood with the initials, the sentence he whispered in my ear before walking away. They became part of me. And deep down, I always knew that when I left him at that gate, I left behind a piece of who I was. Years later, living in Boston, I had a small apartment overlooking the rooftop of a church. That's where my books lived. That's where time sometimes folded over itself, like the war still knocked at the door in the shape of memory. It was on an ordinary winter morning that the envelope arrived. No return address, no visible postmark, no name on the front. Only, for Shirley M. Johnson. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, a single sheet. Typewritten. Formal English. Dry. But something in the coldness of that letter set a fire burning inside me. It read, "He was seen at the border between Austria and Switzerland, wearing a handmade coat and a blue rabbit-shaped button. He was alone. Entered a small village and then vanished. Some say he offered medical help in exchange for bread and shelter. Others that he lived hidden among monks. No one ever confirmed his name. But he always left behind a single word, scribbled on torn paper before he disappeared. Forgive." That was it, signed only with a single letter. M. I don't know if it was real, if it was a cruel trick, or if it was memory itself getting revenge for all the silence I had buried. But I tucked that letter into the same notebook where I had once written about him, long ago, and ever since, whenever the pain comes back, because it always does, I read it again, not to understand, but to remember, because sometimes the only thing we have left isn't the truth. It's its echo, and if he's still out there, or if he just wanted me to believe he was, then so be it. Let him have found shelter, even if only in memory, even if only in the words of someone who chose to disappear rather than be judged for a past he may never have chosen to live. Today, so many years later, sitting in this worn-out armchair between shelves full of books and the distant sound of a streetcar rumbling by, I sometimes find myself staring at the wall across the room. A wall like that one. Silent, opaque, but hiding behind it everything no one else can see. And I wonder, does anyone else carry a secret like this? Not a crime, not a glory, but a gesture. A moment when the heart chose to defy everything and do what seemed impossible. I never knew if he truly survived, if he rebuilt his life, if he was forgiven, or if forgiveness was even what he needed. But what I do know is that the man I found behind that wall wasn't just a casualty of war. He was a mirror, a reminder, a living scar of what we're capable of hiding and of healing. Sometimes I think every war, not just the kind fought with guns, but the kind we fight inside our own chests, creates people like him, the invisible ones, the ones who don't fit into neat stories, who are neither victims nor villains, but survivors of a silence no one wants to acknowledge. And when we dare to look at them, even if our hands shake, sometimes we end up seeing ourselves for the very first time. I could have reported him, could have followed orders, kept my record clean, erased the doubt with paperwork. But I chose something else. I chose to care, even without knowing if he deserved it. And maybe that doesn't make me better. Maybe it makes me complicit in something I'll never fully understand. But in that war, like in so many others, what was right wasn't always what was written in ink. Sometimes the right thing lived in a glance, a touch, a silence shared between two strangers who recognized something in each other that had no name. Today, at 89, with hair more silver than brown, and knees that protest more than winter itself, I still keep the blue button. Not stitched to a uniform, but in a small glass jar, beside a faded strip of gauze. Every now and then I open it, hold it, then close it again. Like a prayer. Like a promise never spoken aloud. And if you've made it this far with me, if you listened without rushing, with your heart open, then maybe you too know this kind of pain. The kind that doesn't scream, that doesn't bleed where others can see, but still lives in the quiet spaces no one else steps into. Maybe you have your own invisible one. Maybe you've hidden something, or someone, not out of fear but out of love. And if that's the case, then I want to say this. I understand, even if no one else does. Even if the world insists on sorting everything into right and wrong, good and evil. Sometimes living is just about quietly resisting and caring for the ones the world chose to forget. If this story stirred something in you, if you've ever carried a silence for too long, or had to protect someone the world would have condemned without listening, then leave a comment below. Tell me, or just leave a sign that you were here. Because maybe, just maybe, we've carried the same longing down different roads. And if you want to keep hearing stories that didn't make it into the history books, subscribe to the channel. Here we don't judge those who had to choose in the dark. Here we listen all the way to the end.